This is Rabbi Abraham Fisher speaking to you again about Parsha highlights and insights. This week we're going to talk about Parashat Toldot. So let's get directly to our outline. Parashat Toldot has three major sections, and it starts off by telling us about the birth and the early life of the children of Yitzchak and Rivka, namely Yaakov and Esav. Yitzchak is the son of Abraham, this is well known, and the Torah reminds us that Yitzchak and Rivka were married, but now it tells us for the first time how old Yitzchak was. He was 40 years old when he married Rivka, who had been brought back from Padan Aram, the place where the rest of Abraham's family lived, Abraham's brother Nahor and his descendants. So Yitzchak was 40 years old when he married Rivka. It seemed after some time that Rivka is barren. She's unable to have children. And so they pray. It says that Yitzchak prays with regard to his wife, but another way of reading it is that he prays opposite his wife, like on the other corner of the room. He prayed and she prayed. And this prayer is a very intense prayer, and God responds to this intense prayer, and Rivka conceives. As Rivka's pregnancy continues, she discovers that the children are struggling within her, and she doesn't understand what's happening. And so she seeks an explanation from Hashem. She wants an answer through some form of Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration. What is exactly happening? Our rabbis teach us that she did so by seeking out one of the major prophets of the time, Shem, the son of Noah, who is still alive. And the answer came through Shem to Rivka. And the answer, the prophetic answer, is that you actually have two nations that are struggling within you. And those two nations are always going to be in competition. One will be greater than the other, one will serve the other. And it turns out that she's carrying twins. It's not entirely clear that she knows that she's carrying twins until they are born. She might have felt that she's carrying one child who is struggling, and the prophecy says that from this one child will come two nations. But in point of fact, she's carrying two children. She's carrying twins. And they are born when Yitzchak is 60. 20 years have passed since their marriage. The first one who comes out seems already formed. He's hairy, he's red, and everyone who sees him calls him Esav, which means made, complete. He seems to be like a fully formed person, even though he's a newborn baby. He comes out first, and then his brother comes out, and as his brother comes out, his brother's hand is holding on to the heel of Esav. And so he is named Yaakov, which comes from the Hebrew word for heel, which is Akev. And so they grow, and as they grow, they take different directions in their lives. Esav is the hunter. He knows the wide open spaces, and he likes to go out and hunt. Yaakov, on the other hand, is the simple man in tents, who lives in tents, which on one hand means that he is a shepherd, like his family was before him, but it also means that he spends much time in the tents of Torah. Yaakov and Esav are very, very different people as they develop. Yitzchak prefers Esav, while Rivka prefers Yaakov. So they each show their special love, their special preference for their preferred child. Uh, Esav provides Yitzchak with game, which Yitzchak seems to like. Um, but our rabbis also teach us that Esav was not only a trapper of animals, but he was also a trapper of his father. He could deceive his father into thinking that he was a better person than he actually was. And that's the way he deceived Yitzchak into thinking that he should be preferred. Rivka's love for Yaakov seems to be just because she appreciates him for who he is, not necessarily for what he can do for her. But each parent shows a preference. We have an incident that involves lentil stew. Yaakov is cooking a stew of lentils, and Esav comes in from the field and he's exhausted, and he says, "Give me some of that stew." He he says he's so exhausted that all he can manage to do is just open his mouth, and Yaakov should pour it down his throat. And Yaakov says, "Well, sell me the right of the firstborn." And Esav says, "I have no need for it. I'm about to die, or I could die at any moment," because Esav lives a very dangerous life, uh, and therefore he's only too happy to give it up. Our rabbis teach us that the right of the firstborn here is not just a larger inheritance in the estate, but it's something much more spiritual. The right of the firstborn is the right to serve as the Kohen, the priest, in the uh, in the service of Hashem. And Esav is not particularly interested in that, especially when Yaakov explains to him just how much responsibility is involved. And so Esav is happy to sell it, and Yaakov serves him the stew and bread, and Esav eats and drinks and gets up and goes. And we can see that Esav has no particular interest in the right of the firstborn. This is the first section of the Parsha, which, as I said, deals with um, the birth of the next generation after Yitzchak, Yaakov and Esav, and how they develop. The next section of the Parsha uh, talks about Yitzchak himself. It focuses on Yitzchak and Rivka when they live in the land of the Plishtim, as we're going to explain very, very shortly. Yaakov and Esav are not mentioned at all in this middle section of the parasha. The Torah says that there was a famine at this time, not the same famine that had been in the time of Abraham. It's a different famine, and by comparing it, by saying it's different, we're also in the same breath saying that there are certain similarities between them. But there are also some very significant differences, as we'll see. So Yitzchak, because of the famine, begins to travel south, and it's fairly clear that his intention is to go to Egypt, because that is a place where there is more food to be had. That's a comparison to what happened in the time of Abraham. In the time of Abraham, there was a famine, and Abraham did go down to Egypt because that was a place that still had food. But as Yitzchak is traveling in this direction, Yitzchak stops along the way in a place called Gerar, which is in the land of the Philistines, the Plishtim, and Hashem appears to him and tells him to remain in Gerar, or to remain in this land, and to settle it. Don't go down to Egypt. Our rabbis teach us that Yitzchak, unlike Abraham, Yitzchak was not allowed to leave the land of Israel. when he was prepared to be a sacrifice, a burnt offering on the altar, even though he wasn't sacrificed, but he was sanctified for that purpose, and he has to conduct himself in a special way. And among those special uh, ramifications is that he's not permitted to leave the land of Israel. So stay in the land of Israel, settle in it. And Hashem says, this land also will be given to you and to your descendants, the land of the Philistines as well. This is the territory on the coast of the land of Israel, uh, south of, let's say, south of Yaffo, south of Jaffa, uh, the area that is nowadays known as the Gaza Strip, as the Gaza Strip. Uh, that land is also promised to Yitzchak's descendants. And Hashem says, I will bless you. I will continue the blessings and the commitment and the covenant that I made with Abraham. Um, Abraham obeyed me. And partially, the reason why Hashem is going to continue these blessings is uh, in the merit of what Abraham started. And it's here that we have this idea that Abraham not only obeyed everything that God said to him explicitly, but our rabbis teach us that Abraham also knew through prophecy, through Ruach HaKodesh, about all the mitzvot. And he kept those mitzvot as one who had access to prophetic inspiration. And so he stays. Yitzchak stays in that area. And as the people ask him, who is that woman you're traveling with? He says, she is my sister, similar to what Abraham and Sarah did in the previous generation, once when they were in Egypt and once when they were in the land of the Plishtim also. Both cases, they said that they were brother and sister, the idea being that Yitzchak would not be killed so that someone could take Rivka. Because that's what had happened in the previous generation with Abraham and Sarah, both first in Egypt and then in the land of the Plishtim. In both cases, Sarah was taken, but Abraham wasn't killed because Abraham was saying he was the brother rather than the husband. But this time, in the land of the Plishtim, Yitzchak says, she is my sister, but nothing happens. Nobody tries to take Rivka. They leave her alone. It's entirely possible that they've learned their lesson. The legacy of Abraham being very strong among them. Abraham clearly has a very strong connection with God, and God will punish those who harm Abraham and Sarah. So maybe the same thing is going to happen in the case of Yitzchak and Rivka, whatever it may be. So they just leave them alone. And after being there for a considerable amount of time, they kind of let their guard down. Yitzchak and Rivka do, and it's very clear to Avimelech that Yitzchak and Rivka are not brother and sister, but they are husband and wife. By the way, they're behaving, and Avimelech confronts Yitzchak. He summons him and says, why did you do this? Why would you pass yourselves off as brother and sister? Something terrible could have happened. And Yitzchak said, well, I was afraid for my life. And then Avimelech says to his people, do not harm this man or his wife. Anyone who does will be put to death. And so Yitzchak is under some kind of protection. So Yitzchak remains, and he plants, and he is very successful. Even though it's a famine, and even though this is not the most fertile part of the country, nevertheless, Yitzchak is exceptionally successful. The result of this is the Philistines, are jealous. And the way they express their jealousy is on a number of levels, but primarily it has to do with wells. When you dig a well in a part of the world where you really need water, then if you discover a well, then it's yours. You can give it a name, and that name stays connected with you and with your family. And apparently, during the time in the previous generation when Abraham had been there, he dug wells, or Abraham's workers dug wells and gave them names. But in the years since Abraham has died, in the many years that have passed since then, the Pelishtim have stopped up the wells. Not only stopped them, but covered them and filled them in completely, so that no one would even know where the wells are. They're really spiting themselves, even though they want to disconnect the land and these wells in particular from Abraham and Abraham's family. Still, there's water there that they could use. Nevertheless, they stopped them up. And Avimelech uh, sends again for Yitzchak and tells him, "You must move away. You must get farther away from here. Nobody's going to hurt you, but you're too strong. You're too wealthy." And he's Avimelech in particular is jealous, and so Yitzchak begins to move away, but not before redigging the wells that Abraham had dug in his generation, and giving those wells back their original names that Abraham had. So Yitzchak is continuing the connection with the land. Yitzchak has moved farther away from Gerar, and every step he moves farther away from Gerar and closer to Beersheba. Means that basically he's traveling in an easterly direction. And every time he discovers a new well, or his workers discover a new well, there's trouble. Well, the first two times there's trouble. The first well that they discover, and which the workers of the shepherds of the area dispute with Yitzchak's shepherds over this well. Yitzchak calls this well Esek, which means contention, strife, and because it was the well was discovered, but it was accompanied by strife, and so he moves away, and they dig some more in the area, and they find another well, and the shepherds of the local area dispute with the shepherds of Yitzchak over this well as well, and so Yitzchak calls it Sitna, which means hatred, controversy, and so here again, the wells are accompanied by hatred and controversy, and then they dig a third well, and this time there is no controversy over it. They leave them alone, and so Yitzchak calls this third well Rehovot, which means expanses, meaning we now can live expansively without fear in the land, and we will multiply in the land. Yitzchak is constantly moving farther and farther away from Gerar. Hashem appears to Yitzchak again and renews the blessings that he has given. And because Hashem has appeared to him, Yitzchak builds an altar, which is very similar to what Abraham did. When Abraham had an encounter with Hashem, he builds an altar to commemorate this and to use it as an opportunity to teach others. And in the meanwhile, Yitzchak's workers have discovered yet another well. Before anything else can happen with that well, Yitzchak is visited by Avimelech this time, and Pichol. Pichol is his general, and they come and they say, we know that you're a very powerful person, you're very successful. We want to make a covenant with you, a kind of a treaty, a non-aggression treaty with you. We want it to be established and declared for anyone to hear that we never harmed you. It should be very, very clear, we never harmed you. It's true they told him to move away, but they never harmed him. And they make this brit. Yitzchak celebrates them with a feast, and then Avimelech and Pichol and his entourage leave. No sooner do they leave that Yitzchak's workers come and report about this newest well that they have discovered, um, and they name the well Shiva, which means seven, and that's connected with the city which is right nearby, Be'er Sheva, the well of seven. Be'er Sheva had been named before, but this is yet another well in the area, and it's possible that this is the seventh well. The wells that were dug in the time of Abraham were three wells, and then another three wells, two of which there was controversy, and the third where there was no controversy, and then there's this one. So this is the seventh well. That could be another reason why it's called Sheva. So in this section of the Parsha, it's made very clear how Yitzchak, on the one hand, is very successful, and Hashem blesses him. On the other hand, there is no getting along really with the local people. They're jealous of him. They strive with him, and of course, mainly it's their fault for not doing more to try to learn from their encounter with Yitzchak, which could have been for their benefit. The most they're willing to do, after many examples of suffering, is to make a covenant, a non-aggression treaty with Yitzchak. The third and last section of the parasha has to do with the struggle over Yitzchak's blessing. Yitzchak is going to give a blessing. He wants to give a blessing, and there is a definite struggle between the sons over this. The first thing that we're told in this section is that Esav, who is 40 years old, which means that Yitzchak is 100 years old, Esav marries two Hittite women. And this causes distress to his parents. And the reason why they're so distressed is because the Hittites are idolaters. And one thing that the family of Abraham should not be prepared to put up with is idolatry in their family. And yet Esav marries them, and therefore parents are distressed. And not only Rivka is distressed, who prefers Yaakov anyway, but Yitzchak as well is distressed. He expected better from Esav. Then we come to the story of the actual blessing. But this first incident about Esav marrying the Hittite women, and Esav's marriage in general, is going to be an important beginning point and end point for this whole episode involving the blessings. Yitzchak wants to bless Esav. Esav is the older one, and Yitzchak tells Esav he wants to give him a blessing. He's getting older. He doesn't know how much longer he's going to live. And so he says to Esav, prepare the kind of food that I like, prepare game for me, and I will bless you. And Esav goes to fulfill his father's wishes. And it's important to point out that for all of Esav's flaws, his devotion to his father is really exemplary. So Esav leaves, and in the meanwhile, Rivka was overhearing all of this and says that this blessing really has to go to Yaakov, not to Esav. And so she tells him that he must disguise himself as Esav. Remember, Yitzchak is going blind, and therefore it will be difficult for him to see. And Rivka is going to prepare food from their own flock, which she knows how to prepare in such a way that Yitzchak won't be able to tell the difference between it and game. And in the meanwhile, Yaakov will present himself as Esav and receive the blessings after giving this food to Yitzchak. Yaakov is concerned that Yitzchak will find out the ruse, uh, Rivka takes some of the skins from the goat that she prepares. She takes the skins, which is all hairy, and places pieces of the skin with the hair um, on certain parts of Yaakov's body, so that it feels hairy the same way that Esav is hairy. And Rivka says that if your father curses you, then the curse will apply to me and not to you. And so Yaakov comes in, and when asked, he says he's Esav, and Yitzchak eats the food and eventually blesses Yaakov, thinking that he is Esav. So he gives Yaakov Esav's blessing, and he leaves. And then Esav returns, and during the deception is very quickly discovered. Because when Esav says, "Come, father, and eat what I've prepared for you," Yitzchak said, "Somebody just served me." And he adds that the one who served me will be blessed. I gave him a blessing. He will be blessed. That blessing will stick. It will not be overturned. Esav realizes what has happened. That Yaakov has passed himself off as Esav, and Esav cries, and Yitzchak gives Esav a blessing. Uh, Maybe not the blessing that he had originally intended, but a blessing nonetheless. And when he leaves, Esav vows that he is going to kill Yaakov, his brother. He may have to wait until after his father dies, but the time will come that he will kill Yaakov. Rivka knows about this, and so she says to Yaakov, "You must leave. You must go to my brother Lavan to be safe from your brother, and stay there for a period of time. I will send for you. I will send for you when things are safe, when Esav calms down, when he realizes that there's no point in trying to kill you. And so I will send for you." Rivka then speaks to Yitzchak and points out the fact that Yaakov is still unmarried, and if Yaakov also, like Esav, marries local Hittite, that is to say, idolatrous women, then I don't want to live anymore, she says. And so Rivka says to Yitzchak, "Send Yaakov to Lavan, to my brother, to find a wife from among his daughters. We don't want a repeat of what happened in the case of Esav." And so Rivka gives Yitzchak a reason for sending Yaakov to Lavan, but he doesn't say that also that it's in order to save Yaakov's life. She doesn't say that. And now Yitzchak summons Yaakov, and he says, "Time has come. Go to Lavan, your uncle, and find a wife." And then Yitzchak, who knows that he's speaking to Yaakov, gives him a blessing. He says, "May Hashem bless you," and he points out explicitly, "May Hashem bless you with the blessings of Avraham," which means, or at least suggests, that the blessing that Yitzchak gave when he thought he was giving it to Esav was not the blessing of Abraham. The blessing of Abraham is that you're going to create the people that's now known as the Jewish people, and that people will be given this land. Okay, that blessing was neither said nor even alluded to in the blessings that Yitzchak gave Esav. He said to the one he thought was Esav, there were some impressive blessings, but they weren't the blessings of Abraham. Now that Yitzchak knows he's talking to Yaakov, he gives him the Abraham blessing. In other words, Yitzchak never intended for the third of the patriarchs to be Esav. It wasn't going to be Abraham, Yitzchak, and Esav. It was going to be Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov from the beginning. And you see that because now Yaakov is receiving the brachot of Abraham. It's just that Yitzchak wanted to give Esav a bracha that is appropriate to Esav. And so, in dual obedience to his parents, both for his mother's reasons and for his father's reasons, Yaakov departs for Laban's home, and he is on his way. The parasha concludes with another instance of Esav marrying. He realizes that the marriage of the Hittite women is not to his parents' approval, and so he decides to marry two more women. And he purposely goes to the family of Yishmael and marries two of Yishmael's daughters. Uh, and in this way, it will be closer to the family, closer to monotheism, and that would be appropriate. The only problem is not that he does this. This in and of itself is would be commendable. The problem is he does nothing about severing his relationship with the Hittite women. So he marries these two daughters of Yishmael in addition to his the Hittite women. So Esav hasn't completely learned his lesson, um, partially, but not completely. And so now uh, Yaakov is on his way to live with Lavan, but that will continue in next week's Parsha. I thought we'd take a look at the incident where where Yitzchak digs the wells. Um, so they were digging in the stream in the wadi. They found a well of spring water, living water, moving water, and there was quarreling. So the water and the herdsmen of Gerar say this water is ours. So he called it Esek. Talking about that. Why is it called that? Because they contended. That's what Esek means, to contend. Contend with someone, to dispute. And they did another well, and that one they disputed also. And this one is called Sitna. Now, it doesn't explain why it's called that, but it's very clear that Sitna is a word that means hatred, resentment. Then there's a third well. He moves, digs another well. There's no quarreling there, as he calls it, Rechovot, which is expanses. And he says, now at last God has granted us ample space to increase in the land. Ample space. God has made things wide for us. So this is the incident of the three wells, Esek, Sitna, and Rechovot. I want to share with you the comments of the Ramban on this passage. The Ramban, here it is in Hebrew, points out that the Torah spends quite a bit of detail in explaining about these three wells, even though at first glance these incidents don't really show much insight into Yitzchak. He's digging wells, he has to make a living, and so on. He struggled, he names them. Doesn't seem to serve, at first glance, much of a purpose. Remember, not every incident in the life of the Avot and the Imahot, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, not every incident is listed, is explained in the Torah. And yet, here's an incident where the Torah talks about it in some detail. So, the Ramban's answer is that actually this incident is very, very profound. It's a hidden matter because the key here is that the well of water, the well of living water, refers to is an allusion to the temple. The temple. And let's recall that there were two temples, each of which was destroyed, and we wait for the third temple. So according to the Ramban, these three wells, two that were accompanied with strife, and one which was accompanied by expansiveness, peace, that symbolizes the third Beit HaMikdash. That's why it's called a well of flowing water, a well of living water, because that is associated with Hashem, who flows spiritual strength towards us. first well is called Esek, contention, because that alludes specifically to the first temple. There were many arguments with our enemies during the time when the first temple was destroyed. Many different conflicts with many different nations, till eventually the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. After the exile was over, they returned and they built the second temple. And Yitzchak calls the second well Sitna, hatred, which is even harsher than the first, because the second temple was accompanied by real hatred, as he quotes from the book of Ezra, that as they were building the temple during the reign of Achashverosh, which is interesting, could be the same Achashverosh as the Purim story, although there was more than one Achashverosh, but during that time, there were local people who were living in the land, who were not part of the Jewish people, and they wrote accusations to the government, saying that it's not right for them to build the temple. And the same word is used, sitna. And throughout the time that the second Beit HaMikdash stood, there were enemies who were hateful until eventually the enemies destroyed it, and we went into a terrible exile from it. So those two wells symbolize those two temples. Now, the third well is called Rechovot, expansion, and that's an allusion to the future third temple. May it be built speedily in our days. When it'll be built, it will be built without conflict, without dispute. This is as was the case of this well. And God will expand our borders. There's the connection to the name Rechovot, expansion. Quote, the Ramban quotes this verse in the book of Dvarim. God will, when Hashem will expand your boundary as he swore. That's a future time. Now, about that third temple, it said that it expanded. So that's a verse of Yechezkel. So that also alludes to another way of alluding to the third temple. He concludes by saying that the expression "ufarinu va'aretz," that we can be fruitful in the land, actually refer. In what way will they be fruitful? They'll be fruitful in the way that other nations will line up together and join together with Israel and serve Hashem. So, as it turns out, this incident involving the three wells is not a very simple incident at all. It's really an incident that the Torah sees fit to record and in all of its detail in the Torah, because it symbolizes something very, very profound and very important throughout our generations, that Hashem made it possible for Israel to have two temples so far, and he will provide a third temple. As the Ramban explains, may it be built speedily in our days, and that's why this third well is called Rechovot, expansiveness or expanses, because that third temple will be accompanied by an expansive feeling of not being argued with and expansion in the land. And so this brings us to the end of our discussion about Parashat Toldot, which is primarily about the life of Yitzchak, but before that, how Yaakov and Esav came to be, and their struggles, both in the beginning and later on, their struggles over the blessing, which eventually led to Yaakov leaving home to live far away, to live with his uncle Lavan. And as I said, that next episode we'll learn more about next time. So thank you very much for joining me. I look forward to learning with you again in the future. This has been Rabbi Abraham Fisher for Parsha Insights and Highlights and Insights for Darchei Noam. And I wish all of you a good rest of the week. Chodesh Tov, a good new month of Kislev, and eventually Shabbat Shalom. Shalom, everyone.